Hello friends, we will start with a new lecture today and it is about microstructure evolution. In hot deformation process, the main purpose of our doing this particular process is to change the microstructure or bring new microstructural features, okay, and that is done through hot deformation process. Okay, so we want to understand that what microstructure evolution can takes place, and basically to understand the different type of microstructural features, because these features will keep coming in the remaining lectures. Okay, so I will introduce those features to you, so that when we are referring to those features or those techniques to understand the features, okay, you will be able to relate with this particular lecture. Okay, so the microstructure features which are important during hot deformation process, okay, which we try to do or which we try to change through hot deformation process, is basically grain size. Main purpose is to refine the grain size. Okay, so because grain size refinement, as you know the Hall Page relationship, so with refinement in grain size you get more strength. Another is grain shape. Okay, so with different hot deformation process you get different kind of shapes. Okay, it can be equiaxed shape, means in all the axis or in all the direction the size of the grain is same. Okay, or it can be, as we can say that it can have a elongated grains, okay, like this. Then grain boundary character distribution. Okay, so you already know that there is some features called grain boundary in the microstructure. In that also there are differences. Okay, some are low angle grain boundary, some are high angle grain boundary. So what is the grain boundary character distribution, and of course crystallographic texture. So the hot deformation process which bring changes in these features, okay, as I told you about grain size, grain shape, grain boundary character distribution and crystallographic texture. Okay, so the processes which bring these changes in these particular features and which are used in hot deformation processes or which are acting during the hot deformation processes, okay, are dynamic recovery, dynamic recrystallization. In dynamic recrystallization also there are 2-3 different distinct processes have been identified by researchers. These are discontinuous dynamic recrystallization, which is also called as classical dynamic recrystallization, where you have nucleation and growth, and these we will of course study or discuss in detail in the coming lectures. Then you have a continuous dynamic recrystallization. Okay, recently people have started talking about this a lot. In fact, now it happens that people feel that continuous dynamic recrystallization is the most common and the discontinuous is taking place only in few cases. And then geometrical dynamic recrystallization and another class of recrystallization or dynamic recrystallization which is called metadynamic recrystallization. So we will see these recrystallization processes also in detail. Okay. Right now we would like to see what kind of microstructural changes takes place during the deformation process. If you see the changes which takes place, a very simple way of looking at it is in this particular slide. Okay. Of course, this kind of deformation we are doing at lower temperature. So, you can see that it is a room temperature deformation, and the material which is used is 304 stainless steel polycrystalline. Okay. And they have the researcher have done a very elaborate work on this. Okay, that they have taken the sample from different stages during the deformation process. Okay, and in these are TEM micrographs. Okay, and they are showing the how the dislocations are arranged. Okay, so please remember that this is not a high temperature deformation. This is a room temperature deformation, that means low temperature deformation. So, lot of the processes which happens at high temperature is not going to take place here, okay. But deformation will always be either through dislocation or twinning. Usually most usual process is through dislocation movement, dislocation generation and dislocation movement. So, this dislocation actually are rearranging, okay, in kind of they are tangling with each other, they are interacting with each other, and they are forming this kind of small cells, okay, and a very thick, you can see very thick boundary is there of these dislocations. Okay. So, this is what you will see usually in case of a low temperature deformation, okay, that dislocation generation is taking place and then they are tangling and making this kind of cell, okay, and these are cell walls. Okay. Now, this is a more elaborate kind of picture, okay, showing that what kind of microstructure evolution takes place as a function of strain. Okay. These are all schematic, okay, with strain and temperature. Okay. So, the upper ones are shown for cold work material, okay, and you can see that the strain is increasing from left to right. Okay. Cold work microstructure are at the top and hot work microstructure are at the bottom. Okay. And I would say that a demarcation between cold work and hot work will be, let us say, I would say we will take 0.4 of melting point of that material, okay, as the demarcation between hot work and cold work. So, below this we will say cold work, above this we will say hot work. There is another segregation here which is also called warm working. Okay. So, another addition is there now. So, you have hot working, warm working and cold working. Okay. So, in cold work material you can see that the dislocations are getting entangled with each other, okay, and as you increase the strain, okay. So, these cells which are formed initially are becoming smaller, okay, and the width of the cell wall is increasing, okay. At even higher strain the cell wall are becoming even more thicker and the cell size is becoming smaller and smaller. So, you will have very large dislocations density inside the material. Okay. Now, if you compare this with the hot work material, okay, here also you can see that of course dislocation will be there as you are increasing the strain. Okay. And now we are calling them as sub boundaries. Okay. So, this thick line are actually high angle grain boundaries and the smaller thinner lines or this kind of dashed lines are the sub grain boundaries. Okay. So, sub boundaries or sub grain boundaries. Okay. So, you can see that they are becoming thicker and thicker, okay, and again the grain is getting subdivided into sub grains, okay, and these are all now sub grain boundaries or low angle grain boundaries. Okay. With increase in strain, okay, the sub grain are still persisting. Okay. You can see that the size is not changing much, okay, and in also thickness of the walls are not changing much, okay, but there will be some refinement in some localized region, okay, because of the strain, and these two microstructures are in between the two, that means the cold work and hot work. So, you can see that how the temperature is playing role in the last 4 micrographs. If you see, okay, in this direction my temperature is increasing, okay, and you can see the effect of the temperature as well as of the strain. Now, what do we mean by grain and grain boundary? I just want to kind of do a recap for you. If you must have done this in your material science course, or if you are from metallurgy in different structural metallurgy course for example. Okay. But just to do a recap here, you can see a microstructure is shown here with some dark boundaries. Okay. So, these dark boundaries are basically the high angle grain boundaries. Okay. So, what is a grain? Okay. The grain is something which is surrounded by only the high angle grain boundaries. Okay. So, I would say that all these are my high angle grain boundary, and if a portion of the microstructure is surrounded by a high angle grain boundary, I would call it as grain. And what happens in the grain? Okay, why we separate these? Suppose it is aluminum or ferrite, alpha ferrite in steel. Okay, they have same crystal structure. So, aluminum is FCC. Okay, ferrite is BCC. Okay, so within a grain it will have the same crystal structure. Okay, and in the throughout the microstructure they will have the same crystal structure. So, for example, if you take this as aluminum, it will be only face centered cubic. Then what is the difference between the grain, or what is the identity of a grain? So, identity of a grain is that if you check the unit cell at different location in this particular grain, you can see that the unit cell is oriented in a same way. Okay. As soon as I cross the grain boundary, you can see that now the unit cell is in a different orientation. Okay. But within that particular grain, okay, again this is a grain with high angle grain boundary, again the unit cell orientation is same. Again if I cross the grain boundary, you can see that the orientation of the unit cell has again changed. Okay. But within the grain it is still same. So, the grain means that if you want to check the orientation of the unit cell within that, okay, it will be same within the grain. As soon as you cross the grain boundary, it has to change, and the grain boundary is a defect which kind of accommodate this change in the orientation between the unit cell at the grain boundary. Okay. What you see in an optical microscope is what we call as high angle grain boundary. We will see what do we mean by angle grain boundary. Okay. And low angle grain boundaries, or what we saw in the previous slide schematically, they showed subgrain boundaries. This low angle grain boundaries will not be visible in an optical microscope. Okay. But for that you can do a TEM, transmission electron microscopy, or a newer technique which is called electron backscatter diffraction, or EBSD also. So, you can use these techniques to also characterize the subgrain boundary or low angle grain boundary. Okay. But optical microscopy will show you mostly the high angle grain boundary, and that means only the grain, information about the grain, not the subgrain. Okay. Now, as I was telling about electron backscatter diffraction, okay, a commercial name for this, that is for a certain company, is also called orientation imaging microscopy. So, in some papers you will see that the name orientation imaging microscopy is used, OIM. Okay. But please remember that it is a name of a or product of a certain company, okay, whereas EBSD is a generic name. Okay. And what it gives you, one of the output which it gives, okay, is a kind of this nice color map. Okay. Why I am showing is because this again will come at different places during our discussion of microstructure in the coming lectures. Okay. So, you will see this kind of microstructures a lot. Okay. So, for example, in this particular microstructure I see a very nice colored map. Okay. And each color actually is representing some information which for which the key is given here. Okay. This is what you call as inverse pole figure. Okay. And this is also, that is why it is called inverse pole figure map. Okay. And what this each color represent is the orientation of the grain. Okay. As I just told you earlier also that a grain means a unit cell is oriented in a different way. So, you can see that all these different colors is actually representing the orientation of that particular grain, and for that the key is here. Okay. So, if a grain is colored as red, okay, then its 001 axis is coming out of the surface. Okay. So, for example, let us say take a red color grain from here, let us say this one. Okay. Now, if this is a red colored grain, okay, and if I am seeing from the top, my unit cell will be like this, okay, because and the 001 axis is coming out of the surface. Okay. So, 001 axis is coming out from the surface. Okay. So, I would say this will be 100 and this will be 010. Okay. If a grain is colored as green, okay, let us say this one here, okay, then it is a 110 or 011 oriented grain. That means, the 011 axis is coming out of the surface. Okay. So, if I want to draw that, maybe I am drawing it correctly here, okay, something like this, okay, or maybe you won't see the edges also here. Okay. Let me correct it here, it will be like this. Okay. So, 100 is coming out, okay, and this plane is also what you are seeing will be 110 plane. Okay. And if it is 111, then it will be blue colored and the 111 axis will come out. Okay. So, this kind of map actually shows you this kind of information about orientation, and then you can also do other analysis like what will be the texture and all those things. Okay. But I just wanted to show you that this kind of information will keep coming during our discussion of hot deformation. Okay. Another as I told you that one is grain boundary. Okay. Then there is another detail to the grain is called subgrains. Okay. So, when I would call something as subgrain, okay, as you can see, sub means it must be something which is in hierarchy lower than the grain. Okay. So, a grain I would say is the portion of the microstructure which is surrounded by the high angle grain boundaries. Okay. And within those high angle grain boundaries, okay, as shown in this micrograph very nicely, okay, you can see that there are some black lines. Okay, and these black lines are high angle grain boundary. Okay, and within that there are large number of this white color boundaries. Okay, and these are all low angle grain boundaries. Okay. Low angle means you and the portion which is surrounded by this low angle grain boundaries, okay, these are called subgrains. So, a grain is subdivided into subgrains due to deformation process. Okay. Another as I told you, we keep using these kind of maps. You can see a microstructure here. Okay. So, this is before deformation or maybe a small amount of deformation, and then you have more deformation here. So, the grains are now subdivided, and you can see a very large number of these white portions within the grain which is subdividing the grain. Okay. So, they are a bigger or a bigger grain is subdivided into a smaller grain using this subgrain boundaries, or which is also called as low angle grain boundaries. So, this kind of division will be there and subgrains will form within the grain. Okay, and subgrain boundaries, and if the boundaries which are surrounding this subgrain will be called as subgrain boundaries, and these subgrain boundaries are usually basically are low angle grain boundaries. Okay. So, this kind of microstructure you will see, very nice microstructure is shown here also. So, as I told you that there are two types of grain boundaries are there, okay, a low angle grain boundary and a high angle grain boundary. So, the boundaries are typically they are defined as if the angle between the two grains is more than 15 degree, or the misorientation between the two grains is more than 15 degree, then it will be called as high angle grain boundary. And if the misorientation between two grain is lower than 15 degree, then it will be called as low angle grain boundary. And why we separate grain boundaries on some number like this is, if I plot the grain boundary energy, okay, grain boundary energy as a function of theta, that is the misorientation, then it will have some curve like this. Okay. So, initially it will be a linear change. So, as I am increasing the angle theta, the energy will increase linearly, okay, and after some time it will start getting saturated. Okay. So, this saturation point, okay, this is typically between this range 15 degree to 20 degree, after that it becomes saturate. That means, the grain boundary energy become independent of the misorientation. Okay. So, this we kind of segregate as low angle and high angle grain boundary, okay. And when you do hot deformation, okay, this kind of changes keep taking place. For example, graph is shown here, and on the x axis it is saying number of forging passes. So, you can, for our purpose, you can just say take it as strain. So, in x axis strain is increasing, and this is the fraction, okay, of low angle grain boundary and high angle grain boundary. Okay. So, you can see as a strain is increasing, initially the low angle grain boundary fraction is increasing. So, it is started from, in the initial microstructure it was somewhere around 0.35 and it went up to around 0.85, okay, after initial strain. Okay. And of course, if LAGB or low angle grain boundary fraction is increasing, then high angle grain boundary fraction has to come down. Okay. And as you increase more strain, now you can see that the low angle grain boundary percentage is coming down. Now it is 0.6 after another amount of strain, then it is going even below than the initial microstructure, somewhere around 0.15. So, the idea is that grain size changes, grain boundary character changes during the deformation process. Okay. Bigger grain subdivides into smaller grains. Okay. So, a lot of changes takes place during the hot deformation process, and it makes microstructural characterization as a very interesting process to understand that how microstructure is evolving through during this hot deformation process. Another very important microstructural change which will take place during the deformation is what we call as crystallographic texture. Okay. So, just to give you a quick summary of the crystallographic texture here, we will discuss texture in more detail in the coming lectures also. Okay. As I told you that each grain identity is that what is the orientation of the unit cell. Okay. Now, let us suppose you have a condition, okay, where let us say you have 100 grains here, okay, and in each grain the orientation is randomly different. Okay. There is no a particular type of orientation is there, all the grains or all the unit cells are randomly oriented. Okay. Then what we can show this kind of orientation information is through one characterization technique, for example, is like pole figure. Okay. I can use a pole figure to depict the information about the orientation in the grain. So, when all the unit cells are randomly oriented in each grain, okay, then you will have a information where all this, each individual point gives you the orientation of one grain. Okay. So, they are all randomly oriented. So, you will see point all over the place in this orientation space. Okay. But let us suppose you have a condition now that out of 100 grain, let us say 30 grains are oriented in a particular fashion. Okay. Then you will see that these points are kind of now crowding at one place. Okay. And now I will start calling that, okay, maybe the material has texture. Okay. And of course, with more grains oriented in a similar fashion, then you will have more intensity of the points clubbing together, and I would say that it is a strongly texture or weak texture and so on, or random texture. Okay. So, the grains how they are oriented, if more number of grains are oriented in a preferred way, okay, I would call it as crystallographic texture. And how we can depict this crystallographic texture is through pole figure, inverse pole figure, another term called orientation distribution function, or in terms of HKL UVW. Okay. So, this we will again discuss in more detail in the remaining lectures. Okay. So, the idea to bring here is that when you do hot deformation process, lot of microstructural changes takes place and microstructure evolution takes place during the deformation, and understanding this microstructure evolution actually makes this particular process very interesting, okay, that you do deformation and do these microstructural studies, okay. And because these microstructural changes then bring the changes in the property, that what will be the grain size, what is grain boundary character distribution, then what is the texture, okay. Texture is very important in lot of processes, for example sheet metal forming or electrical steels, okay. So, all these things you have to control through hot deformation process, okay. So, with that I will close this particular lecture. Thank you.